The Last Night of Rothenburg. Chapter 8. The Hunger of Sondrio. The descent from the castle was slow and arduous. The poisoned mist clung to the mountainside, thick and unrelenting, seeping into their lungs and burning their throats. Wilhelm led the way, his grip tight on the remnants of the seed pouch, the only piece of his past he still carried. Isolde moved beside him, silent as ever, her eyes scanning the path ahead. Conrad trudged behind them, his hammer slung over his shoulder, his gaze distant. They had no time to mourn. The creeping death did not wait for grief to pass. Hours passed before they reached the lower valley. The air here was heavier, the creeping death thicker, swirling just above the frost-bitten earth. Their path wound through a series of ruined homesteads, abandoned before the sickness had fully consumed the land. Skeletal remains of houses stood like tombstones, marking the graves of those who had lived and died here. Wilhelm pressed forward, his mind fixated on Caspar's final words. The soil towers, they had to exist. If Caspar had believed in them, if he had died clutching that belief, then Wilhelm owed him that much to find them. Then in the distance, they saw it. A city. It was unlike anything Wilhelm had seen before. Towering walls, cracked but standing, loomed over the valley. The remains of its once mighty gatehouse were twisted and broken, but the city itself still stood, defiant against the death that surrounded it. "The ruins of Sondrio," Isolde murmured, her voice tinged with something that might have been awe or dread. Conrad frowned. "You've been here before?" She shook her head. "No, but I've met those who claimed they had." Travelers from the mountains spoke of this place, how it was different. They said there were those here who had survived the creeping death without masks, without filters. She hesitated. They said it was because of what they ate. Wilhelm turned to her. "What do you mean?" Isolde swallowed, her face pale. They ate human flesh. The travelers said it changed them, made them stronger, resistant to the creeping death. She let out a shaky breath, but I never believed them. A low, distant howl echoed through the ruins. It was not the cry of a wolf, nor the wail of the wind. It was something else, something human, or what had once been human. Wilhelm tightened his grip on his sword. "We need supplies, weapons, anything that can get us through the mountains. If there are survivors, we'll deal with them." Isolde did not argue. They had no choice. They stepped through the broken gates and into the ruins of Sondrio. The city was a graveyard. Buildings leaned against each other like dying men, their stone facades cracked and crumbling. The creeping death was thick here, pooled in alleys and courtyards like a living thing, writhing in the shadows. The streets were littered with bones, some human, some unrecognizable. As they moved deeper into the city, Wilhelm felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them. "They watch," Isolde whispered. Conrad scoffed. "Let them." A flicker of movement at the edge of Wilhelm's vision made him freeze, a shadow darting between the broken remnants of a merchant's stall. Then another, then another. "Stay together," Wilhelm warned, raising his sword. From the darkness, a figure emerged. It was once a man, perhaps once even a knight, like Wilhelm. But the creeping death had changed him. His flesh was stretched tight over his bones, his eyes sunken and hollow, but he was strong, unnaturally so. He was not gasping for breath, not coughing from the poison that clung to the air. His lips were stained dark, dried blood crusted along his chin. Then, to Wilhelm's shock, the figure spoke. "Not one of us," it rasped, its voice a harsh whisper. as if its vocal cords had been scorched by the creeping death. The words were slow, deliberate. There was intelligence behind them, a cruel understanding. "The eaters," Isolde breathed. "It is human flesh. That is what sustains them. It keeps them from succumbing to the creeping death." More figures slithered out from the ruins, their movements predatory but deliberate. They wore tattered remnants of armor, their weapons rusted but sharp. Their faces were gaunt, their skin marked with scars, reminders of the brutal existence they had carved for themselves. "You will never leave here," another rasped, its voice hollow, yet chillingly aware. One of them lunged. Wilhelm barely had time to raise his sword before it was upon him. He drove his blade through its chest, but it did not scream, it only shuddered, grabbing at him with clawed fingers, desperate and wild. Conrad's hammer swung, crushing another creature's skull with a sickening crunch. "We can't fight them all," Isolde shouted. Wilhelm wrenched his sword free, shoving the dying thing aside. "Then we run!" They sprinted through the ruins, dodging the eaters as they emerged from every alley, every broken doorway. The city was alive with them, the last remnants of its people, reduced to starving, predatory cannibals, the church. It was always the church. Wilhelm spotted it through the mist, its tall spire still standing above the city, a beacon in the madness. There! They barreled through the broken doors, slamming them shut behind them. The eaters clawed at the wood, their guttural cries filling the church like a twisted hymn. Wilhelm turned, his breath coming fast, his sword slick with the blood of things that should not have still been moving. Conrad jammed a heavy wooden beam against the door. "That'll buy us time," he panted. The church was empty. No bodies, no bones, just silence. Then Wilhelm saw it at the altar, a map carved into the stone. His eyes widened as he recognized the markings, the mountains, the towers, the path leading southward. Caspar had been right. Isolde traced a gloved finger along the etched lines. This is real. A deafening crack split the air. The church doors shuddered as the eaters threw themselves against them, their inhuman strength threatening to break through. "We're trapped," Conrad growled. Wilhelm tore the map from the altar, shoving it into his pack. "The roof," he said. "We go up." Isolde nodded, already moving toward the spiral staircase leading to the bell tower. Conrad hefted his hammer, casting one last glance at the doors before following. Wilhelm lingered for a moment, staring at the altar, at the remnants of faith that had once held this place together. He whispered a silent prayer, not for himself, but for Caspar. Then he turned and followed the others up the tower. On the roof, Wilhelm turned to Conrad. "You still have the rope from the castle?" Conrad nodded and pulled it from his pack. He fastened it securely to the stonework of the bell tower, giving it a firm tug. Below, the eaters had begun to breach the doors, their shrieks echoing into the night. "We don't have time!" Isolde hissed. Wilhelm went first, his hands burning as he descended carefully. Isolde followed, her movements precise and controlled. Conrad was last, his weight making the rope groan, but it held. Just as Conrad landed, the church doors burst open. The eaters flooded inside, their ravenous eyes searching, their heads snapping up toward the roof. Without looking back, they ran. Sondrio faded behind them, the city of the eaters, lost to madness and hunger. Ahead, the mountains loomed, and with them, a chance for salvation.